Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning or good afternoon, Team Krulak community, depending on where you're joining us from. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Baruch Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, any specific agency of the U.S. government, or any other organization with which our guests may be affiliated. So the Brewcast is pleased to welcome Ambassador Philip S. Kosnett and a panel of contributors to discuss the book recently released by Marine Corps University Press, Boots and Suits, Historical Case Studies and Contemporary Lessons in Military Diplomacy. This book seeks to explain military diplomacy through the lens of both the military and the diplomatic corps of countries, including perspectives from the United States, the Netherlands, and Turkey, among others. It examines the aspects of military diplomacy as used by nations and what differentiates this concept from both military confrontation and diplomatic overtures when used as discrete concepts by nation states, rather than employing military diplomacy to advance their strategic goals. So the book editor and our first guest here today is Ambassador Philip S. Kosnett, retired. During a decades-long State Department career, he represented the United States in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, focusing on international security and post-conflict governance. His senior positions included Ambassador to Kosovo, Charge d'Affaires, or Acting Ambassador in Turkey and Iceland, and Deputy Chief of Mission, Deputy Ambassador in Uzbekistan. He served 4 years in Iraq and Afghanistan as a provincial administrator and senior political military officer, and held political, economic, counterterrorism, and environmental diplomacy portfolios at U.S. missions in Japan and the Netherlands. He also served in intelligence, policy, and crisis management positions in Washington, and he now writes, speaks, and consults on international affairs and is active in education and humanitarian crisis response. And the rest of our guests today are contributors to this book, and we're starting off with Heather Steil. She is a career Foreign Service officer currently serving as Chief of Staff at the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan. Previously, she was the Deputy Foreign Policy Advisor at U.S. Central Command from 2019 to 2022. Her previous overseas assignments include Iraq, Afghanistan, Nepal, Lithuania, and Romania. She has a bachelor's degree in journalism from Arizona State University and a master's degree in humanities from Dominican University of California. Our third guest is Alison Storsve, who is a U.S. Department of State Foreign Service officer since 2003. She served in bilateral embassies and consulates in Kosovo, Pakistan, and Lesotho, and on a provincial reconstruction team in eastern Afghanistan. Experienced in multilateral diplomacy, she's conducted operations and policy negotiations for the U.S. engagement in Afghanistan at the U.S. mission to NATO from 2008 to 11. And since 2020, she has negotiated global food security and UN governance matters at the U.S. mission at the UN agencies in Rome, Italy. During domestic assignments in Washington, D.C., she implemented U.S. assistance programming to support law enforcement capacity building and the UN stabilization mission in Haiti, led a team in the Department of State's 24-hour Operations Center, and trained fellow diplomats at the Foreign Service Institute. She's worked closely with Department of Defense and military counterparts in Afghanistan, NATO, and at Naval Air Station Sigonella during her career. Our final guest here is Mr. Michael Skaggs, who is an associate contractor consulting for the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. In this capacity, he is a senior research analyst developing the Defense Support of Civil Authorities Lessons Learned program, capturing and validating crisis security cooperation observations for the Ukraine-Russia conflict. In 1997, he began his career as a Marine armor officer, leading a tank platoon and reconnaissance platoon and commanding a tank company in Fallujah in 2004. In 2005, he was transferred to the newly established Marine Special Operations Command, where he was a Special Operations Team Leader and Marine Raider Regiment Future Operations Officer. His deployments include Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2012, he was selected into the Defense Attaché Service, where he served as Marine Attaché in Ukraine from 2013 to 2016, and as Marine Attaché in London from 2016 to 2019. In 2019, he assumed duties as Chief of Staff, Headquarters Marine Corps, Henderson Hall. He retired from the Marine Corps in 2020. and is went on to get his bachelor's in history from University of Illinois, MA in security studies from Kansas State, and teaches a graduate course in Russian foreign policy as an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of Foreign Affairs, George Washington University. So to those in our audience, obviously we have a very distinguished and experienced panel here to talk about the book that they've put together under Marine Corps University Press, and we're always happy to promote the Marine Corps University Press's good works because they've done a lot of great support for us at the Krulak Center and the university here overall. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you, and Ambassador Kosnett, I'll turn it over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Ian. So let me say a few words about the origin of the project. In 2021, Marine Corps University Press conceived the idea of a book on military diplomacy, and they put out a call for papers in academic circles. They got some really fine submissions in response, looking at historical topics from the 19th and 20th century. At that time, retired Admiral Jamie Fogo, who was on the board of Marine Corps University Press and with whom I had worked in the Balkans, had the idea of shifting the focus of the book to make it a little more contemporary and also to include contributions by practitioners of military diplomacy. I had just retired from the State Department, and Admiral Fogo thought that I might be a good person, since I had a lot of civ-mil experience and a network, to reach out to others to broaden the aperture of the book. And I was happy to take on that role as editor, and I looked to some people I had worked with before. I had worked with Heather in Iraq, for example, and Alison in Kosovo. I put out the word through my own civ-mil network, suggesting some particular topics that I thought would be useful for the book. More of a focus on contemporary crises such as Russia-Ukraine, the complicated defense relationship between the United States and Turkey. And then in terms of more tactical diplomacy, and we can talk about the tactical, operational, and strategic levels of military diplomacy, I suggested that we have chapters on the Provincial Reconstruction Team program in Iraq and Afghanistan, on the role of POLADs, on the role of defense attachés. And as you'll see from talking to Mike and Alison and Heather, we have people with extraordinary experience who found the time to contribute their expertise to the book. Now, in terms of the audience for the book, I think that there is something in it for people who are interested in history and academic aspects of diplomacy, but we also wrote it very much with the needs of practitioners in mind, both in and out of uniform. In a sense, I think Boots and Suits is not just a history book, but it is a handbook, and we hope that it will become a textbook, in that at least elements of the book will be useful to people studying in the war colleges and other institutions. I should also point out that not all of the authors are American. We have authors from a number of Asian and European countries as well, and not all of the topics are purely about the American experience of military diplomacy. So I think it is quite a broad-ranging work. The last point I'll make up front is that I think that the United States, unfortunately, has very short historical memory as a society, as a culture, and there is long-standing history of the U.S. getting involved in counterinsurgency, in long land wars where we have an entry plan, but we don't have much of an exit plan. And once these counterinsurgency campaigns are over, both the military and the civilian agencies collectively breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, thank God that's over, and thank God we won't be doing that again. And I would very much like to believe that that is the case. I would like to believe that we will, as a race, avoid war in the future, and as a nation, avoid getting dragged into counterinsurgency campaigns with uncertain goals and uncertain exit strategies. I am not terribly optimistic on any of those points. And I have already found in recent months, as I've been working with both civilian and military partners in my new capacity as a consultant and analyst, that the lessons of Iraq, of Afghanistan, just like the lessons of Vietnam and the Philippines and other areas where the U.S. has found itself enmeshed in governance and security issues in cultures we don't fully understand, are already being forgotten. So if Boots and Suits can play a small role in helping us to remember the difficulties of counterinsurgency and civ-mil operations, civ-mil cooperation, and we move it into the future with a sense of strategic humility, I think the book will have been successful. I think I've spoken enough. I'll turn it back over to Ian.
All right, great. Thank you very much, sir. And so now we're going to turn to the chapter contributors who we have here as part of our panel discussion. And as we mentioned in the opening, or before we started recording, I'm just going to kind of call on you in the order I've got you on my screen. So we'll start off with Michael Skaggs. And Michael, if you want to just lead off, sort of tell us about what drew you to this project, what your chapter is about, and what you're hoping the readers take away from it.
Thanks, Ian, and welcome to everyone who's tuning in to the Brutecast. Yeah, so I got into the project on invitation from Ambassador Kosnett through a mutual friend, and he invited me to the project, and I thought it sounded interesting because I really enjoyed the idea of sort of passing on 7 years in the attaché service. It's kind of unique, especially for a Marine, to do 2 back-to-back attaché assignments. So the nature of that meant I had 2 very different worlds between Ukraine and London, and so 2 very different types of attaché experiences to draw from. And so the idea of being able to pass that on writ large to the future attaché service was exciting for me. I'm not an instructor at the attaché school. I don't have any connection at all to the attaché service anymore. So therefore, this is my way to pass on my experience. And to that end, that's how I wrote the chapter. I didn't write the chapter from an academic or historical point of view. I wrote it completely from my point of view as I saw it from both training and experience in both countries. And I wrote it, as the ambassador referred to earlier, as a handbook. Okay, what to expect if you're going to be an attaché, or if you're thinking about being an attaché. Here's my experience. Here's by and large what you can expect from 2 very different experiences. 1, a country at war, and 2, a country not at war, but a country that's pretty much widely considered London, the capital of the world, and all the things you experience in a dynamic environment like that as a diplomat, and especially as a military attaché. I wrote the chapter from that point of view, from a very anecdotal, my perspective point of view, passing it on to the future readers of interest.
All right, great. Thank you. And next we'll go to Alison Storsve, and I'm correct me on pronunciation of your name. I'm sorry. But go ahead. Same questions for you about your chapter contribution.
Thanks, Ian. Well, thanks to all who are tuning in to this today. So I came to the book, again, similarly to Mike, on invitation of Ambassador Kosnett. We'd worked together in Kosovo in a more traditional bilateral embassy setting. And he asked me to kind of recall about a decade ago when I was in Afghanistan at a provincial reconstruction team and draw on the network built there with other interagency partners and military colleagues to see if there are any lessons learned that we could draw from kind of the deep field experience of working in civil military contexts. And so, Afghanistan is only part of the story of, as you all know, there was a provincial reconstruction team program in Iraq as well. And the 2 programs differed somewhat substantially, both in their setup and in the roles that the military and that diplomats played. And so what I tried to do with the chapter is a little bit of a compare and contrast of those 2 institutional experience of provincial reconstruction teams, with an eye to what makes the partnerships most effective in these deep field warfighting scenarios. And so you'll find in the chapter a couple of things like little embedded charts that help perhaps demystify the Department of State and the Department of Defense, the one to the other. I think one thing that we spend a lot of time doing on the ground in field operations is just getting to know each other's institutions. And so my hope would be that to read this as a guide and kind of a practitioner's handbook would be to cut that time in half, so that having a bit of an idea of what to expect of each other institutionally can help really focus on the mutual curiosity and the investment in the relationships that makes these types of operations more successful. What I didn't try to do in this chapter is kind of evaluate the PRT mechanism as a mechanism for insurgencies. I think that's been dealt with in a lot of other literature. But I do think there are some lessons learned that we can draw from places where we had short-term or limited successes, even if they ultimately did not prove to be long-term sustainable, that we could potentially apply to future conflicts. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Allison. And then to Heather Steil, I'll last one we have on our panel here. Same questions to you, and then I'll start going into some general questions for everybody.
Sure, and thank you for having me on the webcast here. Like the others, I was pulled into this project when Phil asked me to contribute a chapter on POLADs, which is the Foreign Policy Advisors. This is the State Department's kind of advisors that they loan to combatant commands to different parts of the world. So I happened to be at that time working as a Deputy Foreign Policy Advisor at U.S. Central Command in Tampa. And of course, I jumped at the opportunity to do this. And I suggested that we pull in another POLAD who had been working out in the field. So Joanne Cummings co-wrote our chapter on POLADs with me. She had been working as a POLAD out in Iraq. So we had the headquarters perspective, and we had sort of the on-the-ground field POLAD perspective as well. So what we really wanted to do with this chapter was provide some real-world examples of how that Defense and State Department cooperation could work, while acknowledging that it's not always an easy relationship, and that both groups can have different perspectives, but ultimately our goal is the same. And so what are some of the ways that we need to work together, acknowledge those differences, but then come to a solution that ultimately works for the USG as a whole? So I think we did that. I think we had some good real world examples of how that collaboration can work. What are some of the obstacles that you kind of have to work through, and how do you approach this? One of our main messages for the military side was to not see the POLAD or your State Department colleagues as an obstacle that you have to try to get through or go around, but to see that different perspectives are actually useful and can lead to a more a broader solution than if you did not have those different perspectives. And so that was one of the key things that we tried to bring into our chapter. And at the end, we provided some kind of real world tips about how to use a POLAD and how they can benefit a combat command environment. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I do want to note to our audience before we get to the next question, we do have a final guest that we were expecting to have today, and that's Miss Joanne Cummings joining us here. But Joanne, if you can maybe talk very quickly about your contribution, your chapter to the book, what drew you to the project, and then what the focus was in your chapter, and then I'll jump back into the Q&A portion.
Thank you. And Heather, I listened with interest to your comments, so thanks for that. As for what drew me in, part of it, of course, was Phil and Heather and interest in the project, but part of it also was my own experience being a foreign policy advisor 3 different times in very different contexts, and being aware that the relationships that are involved there and the roles that are involved there are not simple to describe, because it so much depends on what is needed in a specific context. And the role of a POLAD and the relationship with the commander requires an awareness on both sides of what the needs are. And often I think we State Department walk in with, well, I understand what the needs are here, but unless we understand what the military context is and the draws on the time of the commander and the interests of the commander, we're not going to be effective. But equally, if the military side of that equation is looking at it as, I know what I'm doing, I really don't need anything else, I don't understand what this person does, then we're not going to be serving the national interest as effectively as we might. So my goal was to bring to it some examples of the things that I've seen. I have been extraordinarily fortunate to have great opportunities and great relationships in each place. So I'm by no means trying to say, well, let me tell you all the things that went wrong, but more, this is how things can go right. And with Heather, sort of teasing out what are the examples that we saw in our own actual practice that can feed into a more productive relationship for people moving forward?
All right, great. Thank you very much. All right, and to our audience, we kind of laid the groundwork there. So if you have questions, go ahead and start throwing them in the chat here. But I do have a couple things to kind of lead off the discussion. So I'm going to kind of jump off a comment Alison made about sort of, and one objective is demystifying Department of State and Department of Defense to each other. And I find that very interesting, is that in sort of a microcosm, that's something that we try and accomplish, in a very small way in our own programs here at the center, to include bringing people like you on to help do that. But I'm curious, and this is an open question to all of you, in either your experiences or in any of the things you specifically covered in the chapters in this book, what were some of your experiences, and what are some of the sort of the myths that need demystifying for both sides? To the question of, there may be some military members in our audience, if they don't have any Department of State interaction, they may not even know what a poll ad was. Like I didn't know that when I first came here, and one of our former chairs here said he was a poll ad for Ambassador so and so, and I had to ask somebody else, like, I didn't want to ask him, like, what is that? What did you do? Because it sounds important, but I don't know. So what are some of the myths and demystifying that you found on both sides of that state and Department of Defense divide? Ambassador Kosnett, maybe we can start with you, sir.
Well, let me just mention one thing that I think I found working with the military in the course of my career, because I was a political military officer by trade. So if I wasn't in a war zone, I was frequently working on international security issues in Washington or in a normal embassy environment. I found that American military officers often felt that the State Department saw its job as making foreigners happy. And I would have many conversations with military colleagues where I found myself having to explain that the role of the State Department and the other civilian foreign affairs agencies was to pursue American foreign policy and security goals, just like the military, and in partnership with our military colleagues. And that often meant having to negotiate and persuade foreign governments, both adversaries and friends, but we weren't there just to mollify or to roll over for our colleagues. Fortunately, I found that by the time military colleagues were 06s and they'd been through Command and General Staff College and maybe the War College tour, they had a broader understanding of what it was we did. Yeah, I also learned that the military services all have their own distinct cultures, just like the civilian agencies do. And this is something Mike talks about at length in his chapter. Yeah, the culture of the State Department, the Agency for International Development, the FBI, are all very different, just like the Marine Corps and the Air Force. Over.
Great, thank you. All right, to our panelists, I guess, Alison, I'll turn it to you first, I think, because you mentioned the comment here. If you could expand on some of that, your demystifying goal.
Sure, I can give a couple of examples. Well, the first one is maybe not to demystify, but actually is true. The State Department will never, ever wear a helmet that fits in the field. I think everyone on this panel probably has a picture of themselves in a helmet that is askew. And it is actually true. We never get protective gear that fits. But on the demystifying side, I would say one thing that I found with military counterparts is a sense that the State Department cannot plan or does not plan. And I think that's actually something that the State Department over the last probably 2 to 3 decades has really strengthened as a competency that's really embedded in all of our work. And so strategic planning is done a little differently than the way the military does it, largely in the resource numbers. And we just don't have the same numbers of people to mobilize, but we do actually write integrated country strategies. We update those regularly. And then within those 3 to 5 year strategies, we do annual resource requests that are linked back to those planning documents. And so that actually, when you start to explain some of the planning practices that we've all had experience with, that tends to mesh very well actually with folks in the field who are either laying out a CONOP or laying out a broader, strategy for a team that's operating in the field, all the way up to, a brigade command that's trying to plan the next 6 months of operations. So that's one. Another that I would mention from the state side, state perception of the military. The military does not actually do everything with high speed and velocity. There are lots of thinkers in the military, and I think State Department folks sometimes come to the field thinking, oh, it all moves too fast, and it all moves at such a rate of speed that there's not time to pause and consider all the nuances or the unintended outcomes that could accrue to whatever actions we're taking. And I found that really wasn't the case. I found phenomenal colleagues both in war zones and then at regular embassy postings and up to and including where I am now at a multilateral agency where we work in the interagency together. And so I think we can actually leverage each other's thinking and planning better with that knowledge. And that brings me to my third point, which is I think one thing that we forget about each other is that we can each help the other get the guidance that we want out of our respective agencies in Washington. And one thing that I think that we can do well together when we're in the field or at an overseas embassy or even in a multilateral organization is that when we get agreement on the ground among our agencies and we both send that back through our respective commands or chains of command, and that gets back to Washington, it actually helps smooth the interagency process in Washington. And it helps us get the guidance that we all want in the field that we think could be most effective to implement policy or to implement an operation. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you, Allison. To Heather or Michael, any comments or thoughts to share on that question?
Yeah, just a couple points that I wanted to throw out there. On the mill side, I think one of the myths that they have is that the State Department folks have a negative perspective of the military. And I hope I've been able to kind of change that myth through my interactions with military folks, recognizing that, again, there are different perspectives, but that doesn't make us, opponents. So trying to bridge that gap. And then on the State Department side, I think there's a myth or a perception that their military colleagues maybe aren't the thinkers that the State Department like to think that they are. And I would say that through my career with the State Department, probably the smartest people I've ever met were military officers, both at Central Command in Iraq, in Afghanistan, just some really high caliber, very sharp people. And so I think that's a myth that's been busted. And I just wanted to comment on what Allison said about the planning at Central Command. Of course, there's an entire directorate of people. That's all they do. The J5 is just a big group of people who spend their day planning things. And it was a little bit of a educational moment to teach them at the State Department. We do plan, but it's more baked into our day jobs. We don't have separate people whose jobs it is. It's just to plan out, diplomacy for 5 or 10 years down the road. But it's somebody's, part-time job. And so that was an interesting learning moment.
Great, thank you. Michael, any final thoughts to add on this question before we go to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, a lot's already been said, but I would say that there are caricatures out there, and of course, these oversimplifications are never accurate, right? The military, we always had, I think some of us had the perception that we were seen as some sort of Neanderthals that was going through and breaking everything, and state didn't like that. And on the other hand, so now my perception of the State Department was calibrated over many years. I was special operations, so I spent a lot of time in and out of embassies in Central Asia. So that was how my relationship with state started. Then, of course, 2 back-to-back attaché tours. I spent a lot of time with the State Department. And if I ever had any perceptions that were negative, I don't think I ever did, but certainly not after all those years of working with them. I was extremely impressed with professionalism of the Foreign Service officers, especially. And another thing I always remind my military friends is that they don't get a parade when they come home. Their jobs are just as hard as ours abroad, or harder, living in pretty austere conditions, many of them. And there's no ticker tape parade. There's no free Disneyland. None of that exists for the State Department. And I just always remind my military folks of that.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question I have for you before I go into the audience questions here is it jumps off a comment that Ambassador Kosnett made at the beginning, which is talking about sort of tactical diplomacy. Then you've got operational and strategic level diplomacy perspectives. But I think it's probably fair to say for at least for most of the Marine military listeners in our audience, their experience is at the tactical level, right? They're not necessarily thinking, unless they're at a higher headquarters, and there's some of those planners in the G5 or the J5 where that's their perspective. They're the ones going out doing, personal interactions with, the local population that you're trying to affect or influence. So I guess maybe what do we mean here by tactical diplomacy, and what are some considerations that you, Ambassador Kosnett, yourself, or any of you in your chapters sort of tried to draw out in terms of like that practical application of, what Department of State can kind of do for you when you're the ones out there roaming around at the tactical level?
There's a phrase that you hear bandied about a lot, the strategic corporal. That phrase has been around for a long time, and is meant to make the point that you don't have to be a general or an ambassador or a president or a secretary to take actions that are going to affect the course of history. And that's something that I think Alison speaks to in her chapter. I mean, the nature of the work that was done by the CivMil teams on the provincial reconstruction teams in attempting in Iraq, in Afghanistan, to strengthen local institutions and develop a culture of governance, potentially had enormous strategic implications. And often it was people of fairly modest rank, if I can use that term, who were outside the wire, who had the most effect on the development, for better or worse, of governance in those countries. And I think you could say the same in other areas as well. We're focusing in this discussion on the practitioner chapters, but a lot of these themes are also picked up in the historical chapters of the book. I mean, for example, there is a chapter on peacekeeping in Haiti that looks at, by Sarah Bellagoni, that looks at how UN peacekeepers and US peacekeepers approach the issue of improving security and governance in Haiti in recent years under very difficult circumstances, and discusses the difference between effectiveness and efficiency. I mean, that some organizations seemed fixated on efficiency and speed, and others on actually understanding the perspective of locals and finding sustainable means of moving forward. And a phrase that I've used, that I stole from another former colleague, Joanne Wagner, is that diplomacy moves at the speed of trust. Yeah. And I think that this is really exemplified by personal relationships, whether it is a matter of a young military commander or young AID or State Department officers sitting around drinking tea in a village, or done by senior officials who are trying to build a personal relationship and trust with foreign leaders at the highest levels. Alison, what would you like to add to that?
Mainly that I agree with everything that Ambassador Kosnett just mentioned. Maybe I'll add that I think many officers, foreign service officers, come with some specific skill sets. Maybe starting first with talking to foreigners is our job. And so I think one thing that we can help with in the field context is what are some effective approaches to not just talking with different groups, but reaching them in a way that they are going to be forthcoming with either information or with partnership or with cooperation. And so I think, a lot of foreign service officers go to the field with language skills that they've honed over a year or more. We are pretty good at, I think, mapping people to national leaders. So at the very local level, understanding how people connect and how political parties connect or economic systems connect to what's going on at the national level. I think we're fairly good as well at looking around corners for what some of the consequences can be about outreach to particular groups. If at the local level, that's then magnified at the national level. And then I'll also mention, that was a political and economic comment, but, a lot of our officers in the department also come with significant experience managing and accounting for resources and providing oversight on resources of taxpayer dollars. And so that's yet another way that I think we can contribute to teams in the field implementing programs.
Great, thank you. Michael or Heather, anything to add to that?
So, we were talking about interacting with people at the tactical level, and it's what we used to, I think, still refer to as human terrain, right? And I think that's what we're talking about. The strategic corporal or the attaché or whoever, or the foreign service officer is working with this human terrain. And I used to say it from a military perspective, the days of civilians on the battlefield being something in the background that's not part of what you're doing are long over. And that human terrain needs to be analyzed in the same way that we used to analyze the ground or obstacles or whatever. And so understanding that human terrain, and that because it is going to translate up to the strategic level, whether you're thinking that way or not, it is. So understanding that and being able to work in that is an important part of military operations, and certainly a part of being a military diplomat.
Great, thank you. Heather, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just one point that the others have already kind of touched on already is, diplomacy, people may think of that at the strategic level where you have political diplomacy. And so you have these 4-star generals, talking with high-ranking political officials, or you have, diplomats and ambassadors and secretaries and so forth. But then at the tactical level, as the others have pointed out, you have the personal diplomacy. And, both of those are equally important. They do different things, but they are equally important in sort of getting an end result that everyone's trying to reach. So I just wanted to make that final point.
Great, thank you. And I think that leads very well into the first of the audience questions here that I'm going to pitch out at you, because so this comes from Robert Mosher, and the question focuses on the activity of military assistance and training programs, which he mentions in his career, were DoD operations under state oversight. And I think that relationship captures a couple things. One, it gets into it's a resource and oversight function, as Alison mentioned there, and then it's that personal diplomacy that Heather just talked about here. So to the panel here, do any of you discuss those kinds of programs, the military assistance or training programs, in your respective chapters, or do you have any thoughts or any challenges you encountered from your own experiences that we can talk about?
Well, let me say that many of the chapters in the book are directly about military assistance, whether it is training, procurement, joint production throughout history. One of the chapters that's probably getting the most attention is about the evolution of European and US attitudes about military assistance to Ukraine between 2014 and 2022. One thing that fascinated me in editing the book was seeing how many of the themes really resonate throughout history. For example, there is a chapter on US-Ottoman defense cooperation in the 19th century, and there's another chapter on U.S.-Turkish defense relations in the 21st century. And one thing that really amused me is that both the Ottoman government 200 years ago and the Turkish government now place a high emphasis on technology transfer, not just buying weapons, but making sure that that they gain technology to improve their own defense industrial base. So I think there's nothing really new under the sun. And these chapters also do touch on the question Robert asks about DoD cooperation with the State Department. And some of this is operational, some of it is strategic. And there are chapters in the book which talk about how the U.S. attempted in the 1970s and 80s to strengthen its strategic position in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, by building defense industrial ties first with Iran, and after the relationship with Iran went south, with other countries in the region. So there's a lot of material on that topic. Over.
To the panelists here, same question. Anything you covered on this specifically in your chapters, or any insights that you experienced in your own time?
Not from my chapter, but in other experiences I've seen where security assistance and training is, for good or for not, a political tool that the U.S. uses with partners as well. And we've seen that like in Pakistan, where it gets turned off, where I am now, and in other places where the demand can be very high, even if other elements or other aspects of the relationship are strained. Foreign militaries still want access to our equipment, access to training, and so forth. And so I've seen it become kind of a political resource.
I can jump in kind of beyond the chapter on Iraq and Afghanistan PRTs. I didn't get into quite this level of detail, but because of where the provincial reconstruction teams were located, many times, certainly in Kunar province where I was, the base was used as almost a joint center. So the provincial reconstruction team was located there, but that's also where we located police training for local police forces, some drilling and cooperation and partnership training with the local military unit that was located in the province, and then also some joined up operations between what I'll call kinetic units of the U.S. military, both Army and Marines in the province where I was, and the local forces, which the PRT stayed abreast of, because very often following an operation, the PRT would go in to a village or an area and then talk with locals about what were the services that they would like to rebuild or to be connected with the government. And so I think there's a real value in the state military partnership in the field in these instances where by staying linked up with what's going on operationally, you can actually tailor assistance to either follow up or tailor assistance that's desired by a local population or training. You can use operations as training, as training opportunities as well. And so that was all being done, and the Kunar base was a base of some of those operations, even though we weren't a kinetic base, if you will. The kinetic bases were further up the road or down the road. And then I would just add that in a general overseas environment, I've experienced quite a lot of this type of the state oversight that's mentioned in the question of military operations in some of the defense assistance in training and military assistance often comes to a State Department officer providing end user certifications. So a typical political military officer in an embassy will often be the one who's got the role to go out to end users and certify that training or assistance is being used in the way that it was intended to be used. And that gets coordinated between the political military officer and usually the DAT.
All right, thank you. Michael, anything to add to that before the next question?
Yeah, more in line with what I do these days and a bit outside the chapter, because attachés, generally speaking, don't get involved in security cooperations programs, because there's a whole office at the embassy for that, and security cooperation office, with professional security cooperation officers that do that. But if you look at what the National Defense Strategy is today, it's about establishing and reinforcing the allies that we have to compete with the Chinese and the Russians, right? And it's the advantage that we have over those competitors. Whereas the U.S. has over 50 treaty allies, the Chinese have one, and the Russians have only a handful. But how you establish these relationships is through security cooperation programs. That's the action arm of the relationship building for DoD. Outside of diplomacy, the only real tool to establish these relationships is the security cooperation programs.
General question to all of you. This is from Bazir Riot, who's one of our regular audience members here on the broadcast. So good to see him again. And the question goes into many of the examples that you all have shared here in terms of sort of civil affairs actions or civil military relations in a battlefield have been in the context of an active conflict, whether that's, counterinsurgency in Iraq or Afghanistan, or, in Michael's case, U.S. was not in conflict, but in Ukraine from 2014 on, they were in conflict, right? What happens to that dynamic between the civil side and the military side in whether you call it hybrid warfare or gray zone or competition? Does that relationship change at all? Is it easier or harder for one side? And how do you deal with the unique challenges where you're competing and you're potentially trying to counter aggressive or even potential hostile actions, but you're not fighting in the sense that there's a kinetic battlefield around you? Ambassador Kosnett, I don't know if you want to take a first crack at that.
So one critical difference that we talk about in the book between an active war zone and a more traditional civ-mil partnership is in a war zone, the civilian agencies, the embassy, if there is one, are going to be the supporting command to the military. This was something that I saw some senior civilian officials really struggle with. The notion that there were military commanders who were going out and drinking tea with ministers and, sometimes competing for the attention of local civilian leadership. Whereas, and this is something that Mike's chapter goes into in some detail, at a normal embassy, the ambassador is the senior American official in the country, the president's personal representative. All U.S. military personnel, unless they are under a geographic combatant commander, are going to be under ambassadorial authority. This sometimes takes a little effort to sort out, but not very much. I think that to broaden the scope of your question, Ian, whether you are talking about counterinsurgency or large-scale combat operations or something murkier in the middle, it is vital that the military and the civilians be joined up very tightly and be thinking about what our long-term goals are. And I always found when I was in senior positions in Kosovo, in Turkey, that there was really no way to discuss strategy with the Home Office in Washington on a purely civilian basis. You had to make sure that the military officers in the field, whether they were in the embassy or not, were part of the same conversation, and that frequently we would have video conferences where the people on the other end in Washington included representatives of civilian and military agencies, because there's really very little that happens in modern diplomacy anymore that only involves a certain agency. We talked a little bit earlier about how state and the military plan differently. I think we also communicate differently, and it's not a question of who's better. There are pros and cons to different methods. I mean, to provide one anecdote of this, there's not in the book. When I was in Afghanistan, I saw that the staff of a senior U.S. military official who had just arrived in country went to one of the senior American civilian officials at the embassy, where we had about 5 people who had been ambassadors and had that title. and said, Ambassador, we are planning the key leader engagement matrix for the general, how often he is going to seek to sit down and, drink tea with the Minister of Defense, but also the Minister of Finance, the Minister of this and that. What is your key leader engagement matrix? How often do you do these things? And the ambassador took out his cell phone and said, I have the numbers of all of the ministers and other key officials in this country programmed into my phone. And if there is a problem or an opportunity, I take out my phone and I call them. That is my key leader engagement strategy. Any questions, Major? And the major sort of stared at him as if the ambassador was speaking Martian, and then thanked him, and slunk away. So I think that is just one example of how we approach these things with different methodologies. Now, I also tell a story in the book about, which I won't recount here at length, about how I found that the military's fixation with planning tools like stoplight charts could be counterproductive, because when people just became fixated on turning all the green to red on a progress chart, that often that fixation outweighed the question of, well, what is it we're trying to do? Why are we trying to do it? If it is taking us a while to get the host government on board for something, shouldn't we be talking about why that is, instead of just, focusing on turning all of the green to red?
Yeah, thank you. I was smiling as you were saying that, because that's absolutely something the military is very guilty of, in terms of, you focus on the slide and then the product becomes the purpose, rather than the tool to help you understand the purpose. All right. Same question I'll offer to the panel for any comments. And Joanne, I'll let you go first here, since you just joined us, if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm going to follow on Phil's comments actually on this, because the sense of what can be accomplished and what's the purpose of the engagement, I think, is often one we don't discuss at length. We just move forward with the formats that we're each accustomed to. In the context of the engagement matrix or the stoplights, yeah, lots of scar tissue there. But working in, I did some stuff with the World Bank, some stuff with USAID, and you have to have indicators. You have to have some sort of sense of whether success is being achieved. But when success is defined as meeting the indicators, then you stop asking what the purpose of that is. I think that what we don't communicate as well as we might is the training and experience the diplomats have that enable us, in the case of the ambassador that Phil was talking about, to sense when communication is needed and when it's not needed. Yeah, certainly there are going to be times that, every Thursday afternoon the ambassador meets with somebody. But in the case of engagements particularly, the question is, what is the purpose of that? And I've seen situations where, people can sort of get into a snit about, well, who is meeting with a particular person? And that can be between the most senior military and the most senior state people, but it can also be a sense of which people are going to be most effective at getting something done. And that's where we run into trouble, because there's short-term getting things done and there's long-term getting things done. And those can be in conflict. And I'll open it up to everyone else there.
All right, thank you. To Michael, Allison, or Heather, any comments to share on that question?
I'm happy to take a stab at the part of the question that was a little bit about civil affairs of the future, noting, of course, this is entirely speculative on my part. But what I'll say is, I think my experience at the PRT was really that civil affairs has an immense strength in reminding the entire team, the entire civil military team, that we're not alone and that the population has a vote. And the population getting a vote, the country's citizens having a vote, is something really key, no matter whether we're forward deployed at a small base or in a small community, or at a big embassy at the national level. It really doesn't matter. We have to keep that in mind, that the country has a vote, the country's people have a vote. And, you know, during the phase of provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan and Iraq, you know, counterinsurgency theory was really in vogue, and maybe it's a little bit out of vogue now. But we talked then about winning the hearts and minds. And I would say that even in the warfare of the future, there is still an element of hearts and minds at work. And you can look at the current case of Ukraine, because I think what we're now looking at in terms of hearts and minds is encountering disinformation and in addressing the just proliferation of information and how to sort it, and helping citizenry, no matter what country we're working in, understand the information that they're being presented, critically evaluate and sort the information they're being provided, and then make judgments about that information. And so that is something that's still an enduring role for a civil affairs type of MOS, if you will, and also for that partnership with diplomats in crafting messages. And I'm not talking about PSYOPs, I'm talking about crafting overt public messaging that describes what our goals are, why our model of development and diplomacy is inherently more attractive than other models that that our competitors are out there offering, why we think our model of development and democracy building is still important. And so I think that those key elements mean that civil affairs will stay relevant. It might take a different form, right? It might not be forward deployed in a village. It might be more online. It might be more innovative in some way that we can't even imagine now. But I certainly think that there is value and continued value in the topic and in the practice and in the profession.
Onto that, because that was a really good point of the civil affairs type of activity and how that can work actually in peacetime. When I was in Lithuania as a public affairs officer, we were fighting Russian disinformation and Russian narratives, so very anti-NATO, and they were being effective in certain pockets of the country. And so, you know, I was on the same floor as a public affairs officer. I was on the same floor as my military colleagues at the embassy. And we had a very good working relationship. Designed a plan of, okay, these NATO exercises are going to be happening in different parts of the country in Lithuania. Let's go in several months in advance, kind of build some relationships, bring the military bands and give some free concerts and do things like that. Get the community involved and aware of what was going to be happening. And so, long story short, it was a nice partnership over a series of months to kind of, okay, here's what we can bring to this. Here's what you can bring to this. The end of the end result being that we both wanted those communities to retain a positive view of NATO and Lithuania's membership in NATO, and we were able to do that together.
Great, thank you, Michael. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think you know what Heather's talking about there is one thing that they're particularly effective at in the Baltics as far as disinformation goes, and that's building resilience in the population. That's the best way to counter this disinformation threat from the Russians in particular, is resilience among the population. So it basically inoculates them against it, and so they're used to it and they understand it. Just trying to counter it with our information, that does help, but if you don't have that resilience among the population that's been baked in, it's not going to be as effective. But one thing I want to reach back to what the ambassador talked about at the beginning of this, about the relationship, what it was like being on a country team in a country at war. I found the relationship between the military folks and Ambassador Pyatt was seamless. And the relationship between Ambassador Pyatt and General Breedlove, EUCOM commander, was also seamless. And it was that unity that helped move the policy ball forward on Ukraine. You know, when the conflict first started, you know, the U.S. policy was extremely conservative, and it was first aid kits for Ukraine, and that was it. But that unity between EUCOM and the country team really helped move the policy ball forward to more equipment, more to a full-on permanent training presence in Ukraine, and eventually down the road, some counter-lethal, counter-battery radars, things like that, and eventually to lethal. So policy is going to drive everything. No matter how much you want it, you're not going to get ahead of policy. But you can eventually move the policy ball forward with that state and DoD unity.
All right. Thanks to all of you. So I'm going to do, if we all have time, I'm going to do one more question here from the audience, and then we'll close things out here since we are past about an hour. But I think it's a very interesting question. And this is from Albert Lee, another one of our regular audience members here. And it's kind of a humorous question, but I think there's also a very sort of important, serious dynamic to it that it's something to think about, especially as we're talking about the context of, hybrid or gray zone or competition with non-friendly per se other countries. And the question is, if any of you, either in the book chapters you discuss or in your personal experiences, if there were any memorable instances of awkward or sort of uncomfortable military diplomatic interactions. And I see Michael smiling, so there's probably at least one out there. And I can think of some myself, but the question's for you all. And the example he gives is he's recently at the Langkawi International Maritime and Aerospace Show, and that's in Malaysia. And he mentions that there were U.S. KC-135 and KC-130 crews at the same air show as the Russian Knights and the Chinese First Aerobatics team. I could imagine some awkward dynamics because, one, we're sending weapons to Ukraine, to no bones about it, to kill Russians, right? And then other, I think it was earlier this week, you had a Chinese aircraft do another one of its dangerous interception attempts against a U.S. patrol aircraft over the South China Sea. So, but those things happen, right? So, how should or how in your experiences did the sort of both the civil and military side handle those examples that you might have seen or written about in your book, or sort of maybe what thoughts or guide points could you offer to our audience if they are the ones in that situation down the road?
You saw me laughing. I'll try and make this quick because I'm pretty sure I covered it in the chapter. But it's the relationships in advance, right? The situation I had that was the most awkward, and there were probably many, but this was one where I was, and this senior Marine Corps official is retired now, but he was coming to town, and we're driving straight to the first meeting at the Ministry of Defense. We were going to meet the minister, then we were going to meet the CHOD and all those folks. He said, "What do you think they're going to talk about today, Mike?" And I said, "Well, they're going to talk about the U.S. Marine Corps aircraft on Queen Elizabeth's maiden voyage. They're really excited about this, and that's really a big deal, and everyone's talking about it. All the papers and ministers talking about it." And he said, "I hate that decision. I non-concurred with that, and we're not going to do it." And we were rolling into the meeting. He said, "I'm going to tell the minister that we're not going to do it." I said, "Sir, the minister's going to now have to tell the prime minister that it's not happening after everyone has already announced this." He goes, "We're not doing it, Mike." I non-concurred. And I said, "So our Secretary of Defense has already said we're doing it." He goes, "I don't know how, we're not doing it, Mike." Anyway, so we roll into this meetings, and he starts off with that line saying we're not doing it, and all their faces turn white, and they're all wondering if they're going to have to resign. But we got there, and by the time he left the building, he turned to me and said, "Mike, we're going to do it. I got it now. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it. So go back in there and tell them to calm down, that we're going to do it." And so he leaves, and I had to go back in there and kind of pull them all off the ceiling. But it was because of those relationships we had in advance, it all calmed down relatively quickly. And also, again, we were able to move the policy ball with the service off of hell no to I'll find a way.
Great, thank you. To anyone else on the panel here, any examples or experiences you can share either from the book or your own time?
I can mention one that's a little bit of an offshoot, one where from the military and civilian side within our own USG camp, we were linked up, but who we weren't linked up with were the other civilians who operate in the same battle space. So I think, and this is actually an area for improvement, or an area that I think future operations could do better, and a lesson learned that I go over in the chapter. But we, similarly to the civilians having a vote in our operations, there are often a lot of other international actors, and the reality is now, the UN has agencies operating extensively overseas. Lots of international non-governmental organizations are also operating overseas, and a host country's own government at multiple levels, local, regional, and national, is operating. And sometimes we tend to forget that those actors have expertise, often have done needs assessments, often have work we can build from, and we actually go in at the ground level again and start from the bottom up. And so, I'll give an example. One of the folks that I interviewed, a fellow PRTer, said he did multiple deployments in Kunar, and then later in Helmand as well. And he said, it never ceased to amaze me that we would have a new crop of PRT members at the base, and the assumption would be that there were no Afghan offices operating with decent computers or file systems, and so there would be an early request for orders for all the major government offices to get computers. And without fail, on one of the first, rolling out down into town trips, someone would go into an office and find 3 operational file cabinets, 6 fairly modern computers networked to the internet, and 3 fairly professional office admins managing the whole thing. And it was always a shock. And so I think that was just a reminder that that can be awkward, because we often go in these situations, and even if we're joined up internally, we forget that there are others operating in the same space who have that expertise to build on. And I think we should remember that we can go in on the 2nd floor sometimes, or go in on the 4th floor, and build from there, and use the expertise and the experience of all those other partners, and partner with them, instead of trying to be additive as yet one more actor working really joined up in a together sort of way.
Can I jump in on that? Because I absolutely agree with what Alison is saying about understanding the role of other partners, and very much of the host nationals. And I don't mean this to sound overly critical. Both the U.S. civilian agencies and the U.S. military have their own ways of doing things, as we've discussed, and often very elaborate doctrines and traditions. And I assure you, there were many times late at night when some exasperated American, either in uniform or out of uniform, would say, gee, this would all be so much easier, if this was a purely American show. And sometimes they were talking about the Afghans or the Iraqis, and sometimes they were talking about our European allies. One of the things that I think will be critical for us to think about moving forward is, if God forbid, the United States military and the civilian agencies find ourselves at war again in Europe, in Asia, that we remember lessons from previous experience, but we not follow them blindly. As the Ukrainians have shown through their tremendous resilience and performance in defense of their country, you don't have to be American to know how to get stuff done. And I think that we sometimes forget that our NATO allies, our partners in Asia and elsewhere, have abilities of their own. They will always understand their own country, their own people better than we do. And we need to get better at listening to our friends and allies in advance of any conflict. And the more we do that, I think the better the odds of actually preventing conflict, not just bringing it to a successful conclusion.
Hey, thank you, sir. And Joanne, you had your hand up. You want to put a comment in there?
Yes, and Alison, you made great points to follow on to both you and Phil. The additional piece, beyond whether people have provided information or whether people have been engaged, is if we aren't talking candidly with our coalition partners, with other diplomats, and with the UN and USIP and whatever other NGOs are there, we don't know what messages people are receiving. And it's very important to know that in order to understand the filter that they're using when we speak to them. So if people have had a discussion about reconciliation. People have had a discussion about ways to go about economic development or about strengthening military leadership. If we don't know what they've heard from other people who are working in that space, we don't know what we're adding or what is in conflict with what they think based on what they've heard from other people. So it comes back to the need for us to be aware that other people are working in the space, as Phil said.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from the panel here before we close out? Okay, I'll take that as a no. All right, so I appreciate all of you staying past the hour to answer that, because I think that's it's, like I said, kind of funny, but it's also a very serious thing to consider, because you're those moments are going to come, and you sort of need to have a plan going into that. So to everyone on our panel, I'll give you. I'm going to call through in the order here. I got you on my screen, and any final thoughts you'd like to share, either about the book and your contribution specifically, or just a sort of a final lesson you'd like the audience to think about on this particular subject before we close out. And Michael, again, I'll start with you.
I think it's a point everyone's hit on, and I know I certainly have, is that unity between state and DoD, I think, is what the book is about. And maybe the cultures are slightly different, but it's still all about implementing U.S. foreign policy and pushing our shared values we have with our allies and partners all forward. And that unity between state and DoD is what gets that done.
All right, thank you. And Alison, over to you. Any final thoughts or comments?
Sure, thanks. I would just add to the importance of keeping the curiosity high about each other's institutions, because we bring different strengths and complementary strengths to these partnerships. And when we're joined up, like Mike just said, we have just a much higher probability of outcomes that will deliver on U.S. interests and allied interests overseas. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Heather, I'll call on you next for any final comments.
My final comment would just be for state and for defense folks, just to keep an open mind about each other. I mean, the same thing that everyone else has been talking about, of if you approach the cooperation and the relationship with a positive light and thinking that, okay, this is something good can come out of this, then it can, then versus trying to kind of shut yourself off or trying to, work around each other.
Great, thank you. And Joanne, any final thoughts?
Only that national goals should overweigh organizational priorities.
Okay, and Joanne, again, thank you very much for joining. I'm glad we were able to get some of your comments here on the back half of the episode. And then Ambassador Kosnett, any final thoughts or comments from you, sir?
It has been enormous fun and really rewarding to help assemble a dream team of scholars, military officers, and diplomats, both active duty and retired, to put their expertise and their insights to work for what I hope will be a very broad international audience. The book, again, is Boots and Suits: Historical Cases and Contemporary Lessons in Military Diplomacy, available from Marine Corps University Press for free as a PDF and EPUB, or while supplies last as a hard copy. And thank you, Ian, for the opportunity to discuss the project today.
Great. Well, thank you, sir. And I'm definitely grateful to yourself and everyone in the panel for coming together and coordinating across our various time zones here. I always love it when we can get people plugged in from across the planet. And I'm definitely grateful for Marine Corps University Press, and especially Angela Anderson, who I think helped kind of put this in front of us so that we could pursue this and do a panel episode about this book and about this topic. And for those in the audience, to the book, I will share the link and the email address from Marine Corps University Press, where you can download the free copy or request a hard copy if you'd like to. And the final thought to the audience before we close out here is the Brewcast. We will return next week. We're looking to reschedule the Talent Management 2030 update from the Talent Management Strategy Group that fortunately we had to cancel a couple weeks ago, but we're going to try and get it done here before we get too far along in the summer. So make sure you're either reading our emails or following us on our social media channels to get notifications for that. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team CREWLAC community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.